Across the whole history of Tamriel, the nine divines have stepped in and acted directly only a handful of times. Set those times next to each other, and a few things become obvious right away. The first is this: when a god actually acts, it's almost always through a person, and that person pays for it. Pelinal Whitestray gets cut into 8 pieces by the very people he beat. Alessia is canonized on her deathbed, her soul locked into a stone that has to keep burning for as long as the Empire wants to keep oblivion out. Ifre spends his own body to become a law of nature and can never act again after that. Trinimac gets swallowed alive and comes back smaller, angrier, and worshipped by a different people entirely. Martin Septim dies and turns to stone in the middle of a ruined temple. None of these are clean stories. Every one of them cost the mortal, or the once mortal, almost everything they have. The second thing is who actually shows up. Akatosh, Kain, and Yifri account for most of the confirmed direct interventions in Tamriel's history, and none of the 3 are necessarily who a person would guess first if asked to name the most active god in the setting. Meanwhile, Stendar, Julianos, Dibella, and Arkai, 4 of the 8 divines, have no confirmed direct intervention recorded anywhere in their own lore articles. That has to be stated carefully, because a sharp viewer will think of the vigil of Stendar hunting Dedra, or Dibella's Sibyl speaking for the goddess, and ask whether those count. They might. But those are institutions built by mortals in a god's name, not the god turning up in person and doing something. Going strictly by what is written down about each of those 4 gods individually, none of it shows the god personally reaching into Nirn and acting. That gap is real, and it holds up across every source pulled together here. The third thing is that almost every famous intervention on this list has a second version of the story, and the second version is almost always told by whoever came out ahead. Who canonized Alessia, Akatosh, or his own missing brother is disputed. Whether Martin Septim actually became a god for a few minutes or just borrowed one's power is disputed. Whether Trinimac is dead, imprisoned, or lying to everyone about the whole thing is disputed. Even Talos, the newest god on the list, has a disputed identity underneath the name. Tamriel's religious history runs on legend passed down by people with a reason to shape it a certain way, not on settled fact. And that has to stay visible the whole way through this, not just as a disclaimer up front. With all of that laid out, here is the record, roughly in the order it happened. The first clear covenant between a god and mankind, the one everything else in this list either depends on or measures itself against, starts with a woman named Alessia. She was born to a tribe nobody bothered to record the name of, though the record does say where she grew up, a settlement called Sardavar Lid, sometimes just called Sard in Cyrodiil, in the heart of what was then the Aelid Empire. A fort built near it centuries later was named Fort Alessia, presumably in her honor. Every race of men living in that region was owned by the Aelids at the time. Alessia prayed to Akatosh and the rest of the Aedra for freedom from her masters and their Daedra summoning armies, and according to the legend, the prayer worked. She was granted 3 visions by Akatosh at a place called Sancret Tor. A different version of the story says the vision came to her in an old Aelid shrine underneath the white gold tower, and that her followers tore the shrine down afterward and built the Dragonfire Cathedral on the spot. Either way, once she had her sign, she started an open revolt against her masters. Aelid cruelty had not always run quite that deep. Centuries earlier, the Aelids had fought their own religious civil war, a conflict called the Narfinsil Schism, between elves who worshipped the Daedra and a smaller group known as the Barsibic Aelids who kept faith with the Aedra instead. That war ended around the year 198 of the First Era with what the record calls the Scouring of Wendelbeck, and the losing, Aedra-worshipping side was driven out of Cyrodiil entirely, resettling across the border in Black Marsh, where they founded cities that later became Gideon and Stormhold. With the gentler half of Aelid society gone, what remained turned harder toward its Daedra-worshipping side, and grew, in the plain words of the record, more sadistic and more hedonistic, slaves tortured and sacrificed to Daedric princes in exchange for armies of Daedra and other advantages. That is the specific world Alessia was born a slave into. Not cruelty in the abstract, but a society that had recently purged its own gentler half and leaned hard into what was left. She didn't do it alone. Her lover, a demigod named Morihaus, fought at her side from early on. In the year 242 of the First Era, a second fighter walked into her camp covered in Aelid blood, Pelinal Whitestrake. With the two of them backing her, human forces started taking Cyrodiil east of the Niben River, then kept going. Pelinal killed the Aelid sorcerer kings, one at a time in single combat. Morihaus led armies. Eventually the coalition surrounded the Aelid capital at the White Gold Tower itself, and though the combined army hesitated to storm it, Pelinal didn't wait for them. He went in alone, killed the Aelid champion Umariel the Unfeathered, and paid for it with his own life days later. Morihaus took the tower after him. By the year 243, Alessia had declared herself the first empress of a new Cyrodiilic empire, and the Aelids were being pushed out of the region for good. The war carried a name for nearly every stage of it: the duel at the Tor, the duel at Ninendava, the duel at Seatar, the obliteration of Narlame and Seladil, the Battle of Helden Bridge, the fall of the White Gold Tower, and finally the duel between Pelinal and Umaril. Along the way, some surviving Aelid kingdoms went looking for a weapon called the Wrathstone, believing it strong enough to turn the whole war around. Half of it was kept by the Dwemer at a place called Kagrenzel, though an Aelid army marched into Skyrim and besieged the Dwemer city of Mzulft on the mistaken belief that the whole stone was there. The siege failed without serious losses on either side. The other half had been handed over for safekeeping to the Aelid city of Garlas Malatar by Meridia herself, the same Daedric prince whose Aurorans would later fight for Umaril. The Alessians besieged and took that city anyway. One siege even left its name on the map. Alessian forces, led by a general named Theobravilius Tassus, assaulted an Aelid settlement on the Niben Bay 4 separate times, only to keep finding it abandoned. Because the Aelids living there were using magic to hide underwater by day and slip out to kill soldiers by night. Once Tassus worked out the trick, he routed them easily, and the settlement was renamed in his honor. It is called Bravel today. That is the war part of the story, and it isn't really what this video is about. What matters here is what happened after, when Alessia was dying. On her deathbed in the year 266 of the First Era, Alessia was canonized. The sources don't agree on who did it. Most say it was Akatosh himself, showing up to reward the woman who had prayed to him and fought his enemies for over 20 years. Other sources say it was Shazar, the god the Cyrodiil sometimes called the Missing God, the one better known by his elven name, Lorkhan. Some later texts even suggest it may have been Pelinal himself who met her at the end, despite having died decades earlier, standing in for Shazar in a role that later poets folded into the story of the Covenant. A few accounts credit Cain instead, tying the amulet back to the same goddess already credited earlier with sending Morihaus and Pelinal to Alessia's side in the first place. Nobody alive today can settle which one it actually was, and the sources say so plainly rather than pretending to know. Whoever it was, the outcome is the same across every version. Alessia's soul was placed into the central stone of what would become the Amulet of Kings. That single act, her soul going into that gem, is what forged the covenant between Akatosh and the human race. As long as her line sat on the throne of Cyrodiil, the god of time would help keep the forces of oblivion out of Tamriel. It's worth being specific about that stone, because it didn't come from nowhere. The central gem is called the Kimel Adabal, sometimes translated as the Royalty High Spirit Stone, and it's described as a huge soul gem of Aelid origin. The people whose god-touched relic now powered the human covenant against oblivion were the very same Aelids that Alessia had just finished overthrowing. One version of events even claims the gem wasn't made for the covenant at all, but formed naturally, when a drop of blood fell from the heart of Lorcan as it was flung across Tamriel and landed in an Aelid well, fusing with the magic there into a crystal that Aelid smiths later cut into a diamond. Manimarco, the necromancer who would later spend centuries trying to corrupt the exact same relic, called it the most powerful soul gem ever created, an artifact through which all things were made possible, even imprisoning the animus of a god and using that power to become a god himself, exactly the kind of power he would go on spending centuries trying to steal. The gem itself wasn't the whole design. Around the central stone, in a golden clasp, sat 8 smaller gems, one for each of the 8 divines that Alessia herself had invented as a new state religion. She had a real political problem to solve when she founded her empire. Her own people had grown up worshipping an Aldmeri-style pantheon under their Aelid masters, while her Nordic allies from Skyrim followed a different Nordic set of gods and wanted nothing to do with elven deities. Rather than force either side to convert, Alessia built a blended pantheon that borrowed familiar roles, a mother goddess, a god of death, and so on, from both traditions at once. That blended pantheon is the 8 divines, and it's still the backbone of the Empire's official religion thousands of years later, even after a 9th god gets added to it and then argued over. Every emperor after Alessia who wore the amulet had their own soul added to that same central stone at their coronation. Over the centuries, this built up what the sources call an oversoul, a kind of combined memory of every emperor who had ever worn the crown, capable of advising their successors. The oversoul's abilities went further than plain memory. During at least one of the strange periods called a dragon break, when time itself came unstuck and multiple contradictory versions of events all happened at once, the oversoul in the amulet was reportedly able to describe what had occurred inside the break in detail, at a time when even the Elder Scrolls, the one object built specifically to record such things, couldn't. A bell was also said to toll on its own whenever the amulet's bearer died, warning the Elder Council before any messenger could. One more way, the relic kept working long after any single emperor's reign ended. Coronation itself wasn't just a ceremony. Each new emperor, using the amulet, would relight what were called the dragon fires, kept burning inside the temple of the One in the imperial city. Those fires were the visible sign of the covenant staying active, and while they burned, the mystical barriers separating Nirn from the plains of oblivion stayed strong. The actual source of that fire is described as something called the Sublime Brazier, a sacred cauldron hidden deep beneath the imperial sewers, said to stretch all the way down to the heart of Nirn itself and described, in the old texts, as Akatosha's first light. Even the brazier's own history reads more like legend than architecture. The text most often cited for it treats the whole cauldron as something closer to myth than a piece of engineering anyone could describe firsthand. Some sources go further and suggest that dragonfires were never the only thing standing between Nirn and oblivion either, pointing to the aurora overhead, sometimes called Kyne's lights, and something called the lunar lattice as older barriers doing some of the same work in the background the whole time. Alessia kept a second piece of regalia alongside the amulet, for what it's worth. She inherited the old Aelid laurel diadem instead of destroying it, had it reset with 2 red diamonds, and wore it afterward as the star-made diamond diadem. Wearing the amulet itself was never open to just anyone. Only those said to carry dragon blood in their veins could wear it, though the sources admit the exact requirements were always a subject of debate and may simply have come down to having the right bearing of a ruler or some looser kind of divine mandate. Nobody ever wrote down precisely. What the Covenant expected in return from the humans who benefited from it was spelled out plainly enough in Akatosha's own teachings. Obey the Emperor, study the terms of the Covenant itself, worship all 8 divines rather than just him, do one's duty, and heed the priesthood. Every one of those 5 commands ties directly back to the same bargain struck on Alessia's deathbed. Obedience owed upward in exchange for a barrier kept standing. Cyrodiilic elders still act part of this out even now. A pilgrimage called the Rite of Akatosh ends with a manifested avatar of Akatosh, ritually challenged and ritually defeated by the celebrants who make the journey, a yearly, bloodless echo of the one time the god's avatar actually had to fight for real. So the whole system runs in a straight line from that one moment on Alessia's deathbed, her soul in a stolen Aelid gem, powering a fire lit from something reaching into the core of the world, keeping a door shut that would otherwise let oblivion in. The amulet drew legends to it for as long as it existed. One of the Khajiiti trickster Rajin's most famous heists is remembered as stealing the Amulet of Kings right off Alessia herself for a time, though that story is treated as legend, not confirmed history. One more tale that grew up around an object already thick with them. It held for roughly 4,000 years before anyone had to test what happened if it broke. The Covenant didn't sit quietly the whole time either. After Alessia's empire eventually broke apart in civil war, the amulet itself was lost for years amid the looting and chaos. And legend says it only resurfaced when a king named Hrol tracked down the spirit of Alessia herself, still wearing it. A fragmented old text called the Remanada describes that meeting directly, saying Hrol was visited by the spirit of Saint Alessia, who bore in her left hand the dragon fire of the Aka Tosh, and in her right hand the jewels of the Covenant, and on her breast a wound that spilt void onto her mangled feet. The two of them came together at a spot that, according to the story, rose up into a hill on the very site, a hill later known as Sancre Tor, and the same account says the meeting killed Hrol outright, with an infant found on the hill's crest afterward wearing the amulet on his brow, Reman Sirodil, founder of the next great human dynasty. The Remanada itself is described as fragmented and mythical, not reliable history, and skeptics have always doubted the whole story was anything more than a useful legend built to make Reman's rule look destined rather than seized. Centuries later, in the Second Era, the Covenant broke for the first time in a way nobody could easily fix. A group calling themselves the Five Companions set out to recover the long-lost amulet so their leader could use it to become a true dragonborn emperor. They found it, and in the year 579 of the Second Era, they began the ritual to relight the dragon fires in the imperial city. That was when one of the companions, a necromancer named Manimarco, revealed he had spent weeks secretly corrupting the ritual with arcane runes, deliberately breaking the ancient covenant between Akatosh and mortals instead of renewing it. The result was a catastrophe called the Soulburst, which tore the veil between worlds, cast Nirn adrift from the rest of the universe, and cracked open the door for Molagbal's invasion of the mortal plane. It took the effort of an entire generation of heroes to undo the damage and eventually reclaim the amulet from where it had been hidden inside the ruins of Sancre Tor. Even after it was recovered, its power had already been spent for at least a generation, and it stayed unused and mostly forgotten until, by tradition, a general named Talos is said to have recovered it once more from the tomb of the Remans, after retaking Sancre Tor from Nordic and Breton invaders during the long chaos of the Interregnum. What that general did with the amulet afterward is its own story, one this list comes back to later. Even the recovery of the amulet after the Soulburst turned into another chapter of mortals doing the actual work while gods stayed at arm's length. It took the effort of a group known as the Vestige, working alongside a battle mage named Abnur Tharn and a soldier named Sai Sahan, to track the amulet down inside the ruins of Sancre Tor after Manimarco's betrayal, and to fight off the necromancer, who by then intended to use the recovered relic to imprison the Daedric prince Molagbal and seize his throne for himself. When the moment came to actually stop Molagbal from finishing his own invasion of Nirn, it wasn't a god who did the deed directly. It was a ritual performed on a mortal, invoking all of the divines at once to channel their power into the Vestige, who is described afterward as being filled with something close to infinite, righteous strength, enough to force a Daedric prince to let go of the world he had already half-conquered. Even Meridia, watching from her own realm, said afterward she could sense the divine's own strength burning inside that one mortal's returned soul. That is the pattern again, gods lending their power through a person rather than acting with their own hands. The brazier itself needed defending more than once, and each time the pattern held. Centuries after the soul burst, Molag Bal sent one of his own generals to try to destroy the sublime brazier outright and snuff out the dragon fires for good. Mortals stopped him, the vestige among them again, alongside a soldier remembered as the Drake of Blades. Afterward, a priest of Akatosh performed a ritual over the damaged brazier that turned the Drake of Blades into something closer to a permanent guardian than an ordinary soldier, blessed, by that point, with a piece of Akatosh's own power. Once again, the god's part in defending his own covenant came down to lending strength to a mortal standing in front of it, not showing up to fight in person. Before any of that, though, there was a much older event that made the whole world possible in the first place, and it also counts as an intervention, in the sense that a group of gods got together and made a decision that shaped everything after it. The event is usually called a convention, and it happened at the Adamantine Tower on the Isle of Balfiera, which is generally considered the oldest structure in the world. Magical dating places its construction somewhere around the year 2500 of the Mythic era, long before anything resembling recorded history. The tower still stands, still mostly a mystery, with a metal core that's said to run as far into the ground as it rises above it, depths nobody has ever fully explored. Even now, every high-blooded Direni is said to be brought inside it at least once, led down to a chamber called the Foundation Vault, and allowed to touch something called the Zero Stone a single time, to feel firsthand the same transcendent power that was already running through the tower's walls before convention ever happened. The story behind the convention starts with the creation of the world itself. A group of primordial spirits called the Etada, the original spirits, were talked into building Mundus, the mortal world, by one of their own named Lorcan. Depending on who tells it, Lorcan tricked them, convinced them, or coerced them, but the result was the same. Building the world cost the spirits taking part enormous amounts of their own power, and many of them simply vanished in the process. A Cyrodiilic text called Shazar's Song describes that cost in more specific terms, crediting the actual creation of Mundus to the personal sacrifice of several gods, Mara among them, and saying each of those gods became one of the planets still visible in the sky today as a direct result of what the sacrifice cost them, bound afterward to the same earth bones as everything else the world's construction produced. It is one more version of the same idea already sitting at the center of this event, that building the world was never free, told through a different set of names. Once the physical world existed, the spirits who had helped build it gathered at the Adamantine Tower to work out what to do next, and specifically what to do about Lorcan, who they held responsible for the whole costly scheme. They put him on trial, in effect, and they judged him guilty. What happened to him after that depends heavily on which people are telling the story, and the differences are not small. In the version most associated with the Aldmer, it was Trinimac, described in these accounts as the greatest knight among the spirits present, who knocked Lorcan down and tore his heart out with, as the old phrase goes, more than hands. A different account has Lorcan spitting the heart out himself, not having it forcibly removed. Either way, the heart itself refused to die or be destroyed, because by that point it had become bound to the new world. Some versions have it mocking the gods who tried to destroy it, saying that it and the world had been made to need each other. Unable to destroy it, the gods fastened it to an arrow and fired it from Auriel's bow, sending it as far away as they could, out past where any part of the new world could ever reach it. Where it landed, a second structure formed, called the Red Tower, with the heart itself becoming its foundation stone. Everyone recognizes this today as Red Mountain in what is now Morrowind. Auriel didn't go into that fight unarmed either. Legend holds that Aniel himself, at Auriel's own request, forged a shield for him to carry into the campaign against Lorcan's faction during the Dawn era, the same shield still remembered today as Auriel's shield. The Dunmer version of events, shaped heavily by the teachings that came out of Tribunal-era Morrowind, tells a very different story about who Lorkhan actually was and why the punishment happened at all, treating him as closer to a liberator than a trickster. The Mythic Dawn cult, centuries later, rejected the whole premise of the trial, teaching that Lorkhan was in fact a Daedric prince, that Mundus was his own plane of oblivion, and that the gods who judged and punished him weren't righteous judges, but thieves who stole his realm and then spent all of history making sure nobody found out. None of these accounts can be checked against each other in any reliable way. What can be said plainly is that every culture in Tamriel has some version of a missing or punished god at the center of its creation story. And every one of them describes the punishment differently depending on whose ancestors are doing the telling. Auriel's own role in the affair is remembered by his own people as the one place he got it wrong. Backing Lorkhan's plan to build Mundus in the first place is called, in some Altmeri accounts, Auriel's only known moment of weakness, an act said to have permanently cut the elves off from the spirit worlds of eternity they belonged to before. Even the god the Aldmer trust most is remembered as having made one real mistake at the very start of everything, and mortals are still living inside what that mistake cost. Even small, physical details of the world get tied back to that same moment. It is said Kynareth made the first rain at the exact time Shazar's heart was torn free, a kind of weather that supposedly had not existed before. Not every culture agrees Trinimac did the tearing either. Some second-era Cyrodiilic bard songs skip Trinimac altogether and credit Akatosh himself with striking Shazar down and launching the immortal heart across Tamriel with his own hand. Though that version is plainly folk tradition, not anything the priesthoods themselves teach. And the heart didn't stay quiet once it landed. Centuries later, in the First Era, Dwemer scholars found it buried under Red Mountain and built tools meant to draw on its power and forge an artificial god of their own making. Whoever actually triggered those tools in the end, the entire Dwemer race vanished from there in an instant the moment they were used, and nobody living today has ever explained where they went. There is a stranger theory about the heart's landing too, one flagged even by the people who propose it as speculation, not settled fact. A group calling itself the Temple Zero Society argues the moons above Tamriel are not tied to Magnus's departing family at all, but are pieces of Lorkhan's own body cracked apart during the convention so that what one text calls his flesh divinity could scatter across the sky rather than sit in one place. The same tradition notes that ebony, sometimes called God's blood, is found running through the lava at Red Mountain, and is said to be the crystallized blood of a god, Lorkhan most of all. None of this is treated as more than theory. It's worth including only because it shows how many different physical features of Nirn, rain, stars, moons, ore in the ground keep getting tied back to this one disputed event. What everybody does agree on is the second half of what happened at the convention. Once Lorkhan's heart was gone, the gods who remained worked out the basic rules that would govern the new world. The same rules, according to legend, that still hold today. The laws that would become nature itself, the roles the different kinds of spirits would take, the whole shape of how Mundus would run without Lorkhan's meddling. Then, having set those rules, the gods chose to leave. Their continued presence in the world was considered dangerous, both to the world and to the stability of existence itself, so they withdrew from direct involvement in mortal affairs. That withdrawal is, in a very real sense, the reason gods stepping in and acting directly is rare enough to make a video about. The convention is the moment the door was mostly closed, before there was anyone around to watch it happen. At least one tradition insists that isn't quite true, that at least one god's exit was witnessed on purpose. The Altmer's own account of the myth says that once convention ended and the rules for the new world were set, Auriel ascended bodily into heaven in full observance of his followers, specifically so they could learn, by watching, exactly how a being might one day escape the mortal plane the same way. Ariel is generally believed to still reside in Aetherius today, alongside the rest of the elven gods. The sources are actually direct about this point, not just implicit. Interfering with Mundus is generally considered to be off-limits for the Aedra since the end of the Age of Myth, and as a result, they tend not to respond to mortals directly anymore. Minor Aedric spirits still exist here and there, but they are rarely encountered, and that rarity is treated as dating specifically from the moment Magnus withdrew from the world during creation, and the rest of the gods followed his example soon after at the convention. Every stop still to come on this list is, in a sense, an exception to a rule the gods set for themselves at the very beginning. Not every one of the spirits who helped build Mundus stuck around long enough to see the convention through, and one of the ones who left behind him is responsible for something everybody on Nirn looks at every single night. Magnus was the architect of the whole project. He was the one who actually drew up the plans for the mortal world, the schematics and diagrams the other spirits worked from. As the world took shape, it became clear how much power building it was going to cost the spirits involved, and many of them started dying off or vanishing entirely just from the strain of it. Partway through, Magnus decided he had had enough. He quit. He fled back toward Aetherius, the plane the spirits had originally come from, in what the old texts call the last of Mundus's birth pains. Leaving wasn't a clean exit. Magnus tore a hole behind him on his way out, and that hole is the sun, still called Magnus in Tamriel today. A whole family of other spirits followed him rather than staying to finish the job, and they are known collectively as the Magnagae. As they fled, each of them tore their own smaller hole in the fabric separating Mundus from oblivion, and every one of those holes is a star. That is where the light in the night sky actually comes from, according to the old cosmology, not points of light so much as tears left behind by gods who chose to leave rather than pay the price of staying. Some sources go further and say the stars are fragments of the fleeing spirits themselves, more than plain holes the Magnagae tore. Magnus didn't have children in any ordinary sense. He forged his offspring directly out of Aether, and his daughters are described as emerging from forges rather than being born. Those daughters, along with a few other spirits, make up the Magnagae, sometimes called the Nine Coruscations as a group, the Prime Archon, said to be the eldest, then Meridnunda, then Nemoli, Yanalor, Londavera, Shezarana, Unalase, Valiasha, and Zerolig. One of them didn't follow the rest of the family to Aetherius. Meridnunda chose to go into the void instead. When she got there, the Daedric princes, already living in oblivion, weren't pleased to find her trespassing, and by most accounts, they chided her for it. Rather than retreat, she carved out her own realm from what she found there. She is the being now known as the Daedric Prince Meridia. That is really the whole story worth telling here about her, since the rest of what Meridia becomes is its own subject entirely, and doesn't belong to this list of gods acting on Tamriel. Magnus leaving, and the family who followed him count as an intervention only in the loosest sense. It's a group of gods making a decision that permanently and visibly changed the sky above every living thing on Nirn. Nobody was asked, nobody voted. They just left, and what they left behind is still up there tonight. Leaving didn't mean Magnus stopped caring what happened to the project he abandoned. A monastic order in High Rock called the Priory of the Golden Staff taught that Magnus watches the unfolding world from the sun itself, waiting for a chance to fix what the gods who stayed behind got wrong in his design. According to texts the Priory kept hidden, some among the Magnagae went looking for a tool that could unmake the flaws in Nirn's creation so the world could be remade the way Magnus had originally intended. That tool, by this account, became the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon, born to tear down a flawed world instead of repairing it piece by piece. Whether that's literally true, or a later cult's attempt to explain a Daedric prince's hunger for destruction in terms flattering to their own god, it says something that the being who quit the job of building Mundus is remembered, by at least one tradition, as the distant origin of the very prince who later tries hardest to burn that same unfinished job to the ground. There was one spirit, though, who made the opposite choice, and his decision to stay is arguably the single largest act any god performs anywhere on this list, precisely because of what it cost him to do it. Yifre, sometimes called the singer, the storyteller, or the spirit of the now, was one of the strongest spirits to take shape after the beginning of time itself. When the world was still coming together during the Dawn era, Yifre played a central role in helping the physical world settle into something stable. But his real act, the one that matters here, came when he chose to turn himself into what the old texts call an earth bone, a literal law of nature made out of his own body. He was the first of the spirits later called the Elnofey to do this, and the laws he created out of himself became, in a very real sense, the rules that let nature work the way it does. Those rules didn't come out as dry legal language. They took the shape of stories, which is part of why Yifri is remembered as a storyteller as much as a lawgiver. This wasn't a small favor a god did once and then went about his business. Spending himself to become the rules of nature was the last act Yifre could ever perform in the most literal sense possible. He used himself up doing it. There was no Yifre left over afterward to step in again the way Akatosh or Kain occasionally do later in this list. Everything that follows, every other act on this list, happens because a god who could have kept the body and kept acting chose instead to spend that body permanently on one enormous, one-time act of creation. It's worth saying plainly that even something this fundamental gets argued over. The rules Yifre left behind are, by the nature of what he was, essentially a text, and texts get interpreted differently by different readers. There is real, ongoing debate between different Bosmer tribes over how to read Yifre's ways, what his laws actually demand, and what counts as honoring them versus breaking them. A god turning himself into the literal fabric of nature didn't settle the argument about what nature wants from anyone. If anything, it started one that's still going. What that argument looks like in practice is worth one concrete example, because it shows the laws Yifri left behind are not just theology, they are still enforced. The Bosmer believed that once Yifri brought the green into being and gave all living things their names and shapes, he set down a bargain with his own people called the Green Pact, forbidding any harm to the plant life of Valenwood in exchange for the forest shaping itself to their needs. Anyone who breaks the pact is said to be cast back into the shapeless chaos the Bosmer called the ooze and struck from the story of Tamriel entirely. The same laws also explain the Wild Hunt, a ritual some Bosmers still perform that reverts a person, willingly or not, back to that same formless state Yifri's naming first pulled every living thing out of. A law a god wrote into the bones of the world by using up his own body is still, thousands of years later, something people can be thrown back into or protected by, depending on how it gets read. Those four events, Alessia's covenant aside, since that one involves a living person receiving the gift, the trial and sentencing of Lorcan at the convention, the flight of Magnus and the tearing of the stars, and Yifre spending himself into the rules of the world, are all cases of gods acting directly on the world itself, with no human standing in the middle to take the risk or pay the cost personally. And all four of them happened before there was really anyone around on Nirn to witness it happening. Nobody was standing there watching Lorcan's heart get torn out. Nobody saw the stars get punched into the sky. From this point on in the record, every single act on this list runs through a person, a Nord, a slave, a would-be emperor, someone with a name and a life that gets spent doing it. It's worth watching, every time, what happens to that person once the god is done using them. The first of those people is Morihaus, and he is a little unusual on this list because he wasn't born mortal in the ordinary sense to begin with. He was already a demigod when the story starts, the son of the goddess Kain, and his standing as a lesser divine being comes directly from that relationship to his mother. Nearly every description of Morihaus makes him out to be a winged bull, sometimes described as more of a bullman or man-bull, with a nose ring, horns, and golden wings that let him fly. He carried titles like the demigod of all winds and the first breath of man, and he was, by most accounts, the finest archer of the entire First Era. Before Cain left Nirn for good, she looked ahead at what the land was going to need down the road, and she made an artifact called the Lord's Mail in preparation for it. The first person she gave it to was her own son, Morihaus. Later, after he had grown arrogant, she took it back from him. That is a small detail, but it says something about how these gods actually treat the people and demigods closest to them. Even a son doesn't get to keep a divine gift once he starts acting like he deserves it more than he does. Morihaus's connection to his mother also gave him the power of the Tu'um, the Nordic voice, tying him to a skill that shows up again later in this list, with an entirely different set of gods teaching it to entirely different people. A plant found across Skyrim today, Cain's Tears, is said to grow wherever the goddess's own tears fell to the earth, a small, physical trace of her grief still rooted in the ground. Morihaus became the lover of Alessia during the Slave Rebellion, fighting at her side while Pelinal handled the single combats against Aelid kings. Temple tradition says Mara herself marked the occasion when the two of them were wed, giving the couple a wedding gift, a chalice that came to be known simply as the Chalice of Mara, later kept alongside other relics of the goddess at a temple in Bravil. Even that story carries its own hedge built in. The temple's own record only ever calls it alleged, never confirmed. Alessia's marriage to Morihaus produced a son, Belharza, later considered the first Minotaur, and by extension the origin of the entire Minotaur race, though this claim comes from later sources, not anything contemporary to the events themselves. When Pelinal finally fell after killing Umaril, it was Morihaus who led the final assault that actually took the White Gold Tower, an act that earned him the title Taker of the Citadel. He found Pelinal's severed head still alive inside the tower, a detail worth setting aside for now, since it belongs more properly to Pelinal's own part of this story. Morihaus's own writing, or what is traditionally believed to be his writing, survives in a text called the Adabal A, one of the oldest documents from the entire First Era. One of its very first teachings concerns what to do about people who didn't want the true events of the rebellion written down at all, a faction Morihaus calls the non-scriptionists, and the text describes him arguing with them and eventually executing them, specifically so the cruelty of the Aelids would stay on the record instead of getting erased. A demigod's first recorded act, in other words, was fighting to make sure the history of what had happened to his people couldn't be rewritten by the people who preferred it forgotten. Morihaus didn't disappear from the world the moment Alessia died, either. One later Nordic legend places him centuries after the rebellion in Skyrim when Mehrunes Dagon stole the skin of a Nord and set his sights on a young girl named Alice, apparently named after the old slave queen herself. An ordinary bull, through what the story calls God Geyser magic, transformed into Morihaus on the spot to protect the child, warning Dagon to stand down. Dagon claimed he had no fear of the demigod, but backed off the moment he realized every son and daughter of Skyrim nearby was closing in, including the Greybeards, who might have called on the ghost of Shor himself. What actually became of Morihaus after that isn't recorded. Some count him among the dead gods. The sources are honest that his real fate is simply unknown. Morihaus is a smaller stop on this list than some of the others, but he fits the pattern all the same. He is a demigod acting in the world because his mother armed him and then, when he got too proud of the gift, took it away again. Even the children of gods don't get to keep divine power on easy terms. Pelinal Whitestrake is the clearest case anywhere in the record of the divine speaking a mortal or something close to mortal, and simply arming him for war. Whatever Pelinal actually was underneath the armor is its own tangle of legend. Some accounts call him an Ada, the same word used for beings able to change the world through love, the way Morihaus did in fathering the Minotaurs, which would put him closer to a demigod than an ordinary man. Others describe him in language that reads almost like poetry rather than biography, a diamond soaked red with the blood of elves whose facets could unfold into a man capable of cutting down Alessia's jailers, with no heart under his armor at all, just a red, rage-shaped stone that sang like a mindless dragon. If that description is meant literally rather than as metaphor, it draws a direct line between Pelinal and the exact same gem that would later hold Alessia's own soul and start the Covenant, though nobody can say for certain whether that connection is real or just two vivid stories borrowing each other's imagery. He is also said to have shouted the name of a ruler who wouldn't be born for centuries, Reman Serodil, and to have worn armor that belonged, by some accounts, to a future time entirely. In one of these fragments, he is quoted addressing the gods directly about his own enemy, shouting, "Umaril dares call us out, for that is how we made him." As though Umaril's very existence was something the divines themselves were responsible for. None of this is treated as settled fact, even by the people who wrote it down. It is treated as legend layered on top of legend, which is fitting for a weapon the gods themselves built and then let loose. Centuries later, after the Soul Burst, mysterious figures called the Red Diamond Guardians began periodically appearing in the Imperial City to fight off Daedra, each one marked with a red diamond across the chest. And nobody has ever explained where they came from or where they went afterward. Some have wondered whether they connect back to Pelinal's own red diamond nature. That connection is guesswork, not anything the sources confirm, but it's the kind of loose thread this whole story keeps leaving behind. The 8 divines gave Pelinal a set of artifacts now known as the Crusaders' Relics, a suit of armor, a shield, a mace, and a longsword. Each one forged by a different one of the 8, and each one built to reshape itself around whoever wielded it. Dibella made the helm, Zenithar made the mace, Julianos made the shield, Stendar made the gauntlets, Arkai made the sword. Either Mara or Akatosh made the cuirass and the greaves, with the sources not agreeing on which. This wasn't a token blessing. It was a full outfitting of a mortal weapon meant to be pointed at a specific target, the Aelid Empire, and it worked. No Aelid weapon could pierce the armor, at least not until Umaril spent years hoarding weapons specifically enchanted to get through it. What the Divine's chosen weapon actually did with that armor across the rebellion is worth spelling out, because it shows both sides of the gift at once. Pelinal went from king to king, killing the Aelid sorcerer lords one after another in single combat. Haromir of Copper and Tea, Gordhar the Shaper, the Fire King Hadhul, and others, each duel chipping away at the Aelid Empire's leadership. Tradition holds he was served through all of it by a follower named Vilius Tarn, remembered as Blade Serrator and Master of the Abattoir, later claimed as an ancestor by the Tharn family that keeps turning up in imperial politics for the next several thousand years. He freed entire prisons of enslaved Nedis at once, breaking down the doors of a place called Vahtash, and later liberating a famous tribe known as the 1,000-strong of Sedor. But the same campaigns that freed slaves also produced what later chroniclers plainly call a pogrom. Whole stretches of northern Cyrodiil consolidated for men by killing enough elves that Pelinal's own white hair reportedly turned brown from the blood soaking into it. The breaking point came when Pelinal's lover, a former grain slave named Huna, whom he had raised up himself, was killed by an arrow from an Aelid archer named Seletalel, the Singer. What followed afterward became known as Pelinal's Mid-Year Massacre, an assault on the Aelid forces holding Helden Bridge so total that later generations still remembered it by name centuries on. When Nordic warbands arrived at the bridge and saw him, some of them reportedly declared that Shor himself had returned, which only seemed to anger him further. He led the slaughter anyway. This is the same gift described earlier, brilliant in single combat, uncontrollable once grief or rage tipped him past a certain point, and the two things came from the exact same weapon the gods had built, The gift came with a defect built into it, and the sources are blunt about what it was. Pelinal was prone to what the legends call stretches of homicidal madness, during which he killed indiscriminately and did damage to the land itself, not just to enemy soldiers. During some of these episodes, he is said to have turned whole stretches of land into void, doing enough damage that the gods themselves had to step in and calm him down, so that, in the old phrase, he no longer had the will to kill the earth in whole. Alessia reportedly had to make sacrifices to the 8 divines during these fits, just to keep them from abandoning him in disgust. This was the price of the weapon the gods had built, brilliant in combat and dangerous to be anywhere near when the madness took him. Before any of that, there was a moment the record calls the Council of Skiffs, when the combined Nedic and Nordic forces finally reached the foot of the White Gold Tower and hesitated, and Alessia herself counseled waiting rather than storming a fortress that size. Pelinal called the delay cowardice and went in without them. That single decision is why it was Pelinal alone, and not an army, who ended up meeting Umariel inside his own throne room. The clearest and ugliest example of that defect is what happened with the Khajiit. During one of his rampages, Pelinal wandered into Khajiiti territory and mistook the catfolk for Aldmer, the very enemy he was supposed to be fighting. He slaughtered a great number of them before he realized his mistake. The Khajiit prayed for help and got it from Alkosh, who fought Pelinal directly and eventually threw him out of Elsewhere entirely, an event violent enough that it left behind what the sources call a time wound. That same wound reportedly didn't stay closed for good. Centuries later, in the Second Era, 3 dragons are said to have disguised themselves as Alkosh and the 2 moons at a temple called the Sunspire, trying to use the Thuum to widen the old time wound and trigger a fresh dragon break that would restore rule by dragons. A group of adventurers known as the Undaunted stopped them before it went that far. To this day, the Khajiit remember Pelinal not as a liberator, but as an invader who slaughtered their people by accident and had to be driven off by their own god. The Mer generally see him the same way the Khajiit do, just for different reasons. To elves, Pelinal isn't a saint. He is the Nibene warlord who led what the sources plainly call the Elven Pogrom, killing elites across Cyrodiil in numbers large enough that entire chieftainships and city-states were wiped out under his sword. The duel with Umariel itself wasn't a fair fight, and it wasn't meant to be. Umariel, who carried divine blood through a father he claimed was a god, was said to be unable to ever fully die, and he had no intention of testing that at full strength. He spent soldiers he had been saving specifically for the purpose, sending them in first, knowing they would die, just to wear Pelinal down before showing himself. By the time the 2 of them actually fought, the ground around them was already littered with dead Aurorans described as lying like scattered candlelight. And every elf king still standing carried weapons deliberately forged heavy with Varlians, the one substance able to get through Pelinal's armor at all. Pelinal won anyway. It cost him whatever strength he had left. Pelinal's death is where the story turns from tragic to almost mocking. After he killed Umariel, the Unfeathered inside the White Gold Tower, the last of the Eyeled Sorcerer Kings descended on him while he was already wounded and dying. By one account, what set them off as much as strategy was insult. Pelinal had reportedly mocked the ancestry of every elf who had ever sailed from Old Elnofey, and the surviving kings, already furious, fell on him in a mad frenzy the moment he faltered. They cut his body into 8 pieces. The number wasn't random. The Aelids were, by the source's own description, obsessed with the number 8, and cutting Pelinal into exactly that many pieces was a direct mockery of the 8 divines who had armed him in the first place. Some versions put the count at 9 instead of 8, which would make it a mockery of Talos as well, except Talos wouldn't exist as a god for another several thousand years. So the discrepancy is more likely just the kind of detail that drifts when a story gets retold that long. They carried the pieces away and left only his head behind, as a kind of grim gift for Alessia to find. Morihaus found that head the next morning, and it was still alive, kept in torment by Aelid magic, speaking things of regret. The two of them had one last conversation before Pelinal's voice, and whatever was left of him finally went quiet. So the arc of the whole story runs from the Divines forging a mortal into their chosen weapon, arming him with gifts from every one of them, to that same weapon being taken apart piece by piece, as a theological joke by the people he had just finished conquering. The gods gave Pelinal everything he needed to win the war. They didn't stop what happened to him once he had. Alessia didn't let the two of them go unmarked while they still lived. She had a circlet made with 3 red diamonds set into it, one for herself, one for Morihaus, and one for Pelinal, meant to commemorate the 3 people most responsible for building the empire in the first place. She also gave Morihaus and Pelinal ceremonial coronets topped with swords, marking both of them out as the empire's living weapons rather than its rulers. Pelinal never got to be anything but a weapon, even in the honors handed out afterward for what he had done. The relics themselves outlived the man they were built for by thousands of years. Knights founded an order specifically to hunt down the scattered pieces, and slowly recovered most of them, though the order eventually collapsed and lost all but one piece again. It took Umaril the Unfeathered actually returning to Nirn near the end of the Third Era, still hunting the gods who had beaten him the first time, to bring the whole story back around. A prophet appeared claiming the 9 divines needed their crusader reborn, and a new champion gathered every one of the crusaders' relics, met the ghost of Pelinal himself above the ruins of the White Gold Tower, and finished what Pelinal never could, destroying Umaril's spirit completely rather than just his body, so that the half-elf couldn't simply reform in oblivion the way he had the first time. Even that final blow needed something Pelinal had never had access to, a blessing added by Talos, the god who didn't exist yet in Pelinal's own era. Divine weapons, it turns out, sometimes need thousands of years and an entirely new god added to the pantheon before the job actually gets finished. Getting the relics back the first time around cost almost as many lives as winning them the first time had. Sir Amiel Lanus, who founded the Knights of the Nine in the year 111 of the Third Era specifically to recover the scattered pieces, died himself in the haunted ruins where the helm was kept. On what was meant to be one last quest to restore his order's good name, his bones turned up centuries later lying next to it. The cuirass, the very first piece the original knights ever recovered, only came into their hands after they defeated something called the Worm of Ellinglen to claim it, and it was then guarded for 300 years afterward by the ghosts of the dead knights themselves, sealed inside the Priory's own undercroft, with nobody recorded as getting past them until a new pilgrim finally beat them in single combat, generations on. Sir Juncan died searching for the boots, which were eventually recovered only after Kinnereth herself sent a giant bear to test whoever came looking, because the pilgrim who found it chose not to fight back. Out of plain reverence for a wild animal doing what wild animals do, Kinnereth let them pass unharmed. The mace fared worse. Sir Ralvas tried to reach it hundreds of times and failed every single time, since legend held that only faith itself could cross what the old stories call the void of doubt guarding it. A saint named Kaladas, who dreamed of Pelinal calling to him, built an entire chapel to Zenithar out of that same legend, and his tomb still carries the inscription, "Walk in the Faith." Sir Henrik hid the shield inside a fort and died there before he ever finished securing it, leaving his own ghost behind to guide the next person who came looking. Sir Casimir got the gauntlets back safely, then years later struck down a beggar with them out of impatience. Stendar himself, described in the record as appalled, cursed the gauntlets to grow too heavy to lift, and cursed Casimir's entire bloodline with the same weakness. A cursed descendant named Kellen was still carrying generations later, until a pilgrim agreed to take it onto themselves instead. Sir Berich Vlindrel found both the greaves and the sword and was buried with them in his own family's tomb, only to rise afterward as a wraith and drag the sword down into corruption. Sir Roderick of Wayres died trying to take it back from him, though his own squire, a young man named Lathan, escaped that same tomb alive with at least the greaves in hand. It took another visitor, centuries on, to finally free Vlindrel's soul and set the sword right again. Every single piece of armor built for one man to fight one war ended up costing somebody else their life, or their soul, on the way back into mortal hands. The relics stayed at a place called the Priory of the Nine after that, until the year 201 of the Fourth Era, when a gang of bandits broke in and stole them, along with a second, separate set of armor known as the Reforged Crusaders relics, styled after the originals but of unknown origin. The last Dragonborn tracked the thieves down to a ruin called Four Skull Lookout, killed them, and took both full sets of armor back. Thousands of years after Pelinal's death, the same handful of enchanted objects were still getting stolen, fought over, and recovered by whichever mortal happened to be standing in the right place at the right time. Trinimac is described in more than one source as the strongest of all the Etada who ever walked on Nirn. He was Auriel's greatest knight, and in some places among the early Aldmer, he was even more popular than Auriel himself. He is usually shown holding a sword called Penitent, and unlike a lot of the more distant hands-off gods on this list, Trinimac's whole role was hands-on work, fighting the enemies of Aldmeri society, both the ones attacking from outside and the ones causing trouble from within. He is even credited in the Aldmeri account of the convention with being the one who tore Lorkhan's heart out in the first place. That hands-on reputation isn't just a general description. The surviving legends about him tend to be specific. A warrior named Avalian, remembered as Trinimac's blessed child, is said to have driven his blade into a fiery god of lava and stone and crossed an erupting volcano quickly enough that the heat never touched his feet. A woman named Vaya is remembered for breaking an enchanted hammer using nothing but a small wooden shield done under what the story calls Trinimac's own watchful eye. A hunter named Usunok is said to have felled a mammoth in a single blow carrying Trinimac's blessing. None of this gets treated as history the way the convention or the rebellion get treated as history. It reads as cult legend built up around a god the orcs still argue about today. But all three point the same direction. Whatever Trinimac actually was, worship of him was never really about temples and festivals. It was about a god who showed up in person to help someone swing a weapon. His story on this list is about a god intervening for his own people and getting destroyed and replaced in the act, mid-intervention, by someone stronger. In the late Middle Merethic era, a prophet named Veloth began having visions from the Daedric prince Boethia, visions that convinced him to found a new sect of Aldmer who believed mortals could ascend to godhood themselves. Trinimac's priests saw this as blasphemy and prepared to pass judgment on Veloth's followers. According to the most widely told version of what happened next, Boethia ate Trinimac, literally consumed him. Different tellings dress this up differently. One has Boethia appearing as a beautiful woman and asking for a kiss, only to swallow Trinimac whole the moment he leaned in. However it happened, once Trinimac was inside Boethia, the Daedric prince used his form and his voice to stand in front of the crowd that had gathered to judge Veloth's followers, and used that stolen shape to expose Trinimac's own teachings as lies, discrediting the very priests who were about to pass judgment. Out of that single act of impersonation and betrayal came two new peoples at once. Those who followed Boethia's revelation went east and became the Chimer, while those who stayed loyal to what was left of Trinimac and changed along with him became the orcs. What happened inside Boethia afterward is described as torture. Trinimac was twisted and tormented until Boethia eventually grew bored and cast him out, exiled to a realm of choking ash. What came out the other side wasn't Trinimac anymore. It was Malakath, and the sources describe him bluntly as nothing more than a weak and vengeful version of his former glory. The strongest of all the Etada who ever walked Nirn ended up as a minor Daedric prince of curses and grudges, worshipped by outcasts. The god who did the swallowing came out of the whole affair better off than the god who got swallowed. Among the Dunmer, Boethia went on to be recognized, first by the old tribunal temple as one of 3 so-called good Daedra and the anticipation of Almalexia, and later, after the tribunal itself vanished, by the new temple as one of 3 beings called the Reclamations, worshipped alongside Azura and Mephala at the very top of what counts as acceptable Daedra worship among the Dunmer. Destroying and replacing the strongest of all the Etada turned out to be the event that raised Boethia's own standing, not lowered it. None of this is settled history, and the sources are honest about that. One account says Trinimac was Boethia all along, that there was never a separate god there to begin with, and that the whole story of a devouring is a myth built to cover for something else entirely. Another account says it wasn't Boethia who took Trinimac's identity at all, but Malak, called the King of Curses, who took his form by way of a curse and convinced a crowd of onlookers that Malak was Trinimac and that the real Trinimac, standing right there, was actually a demon in disguise. In that version, Boethia is the one who eventually lifts the curse and reveals the truth to the deceived crowd. Even a Daedric information broker named Madam Wim has weighed in on this from the outside, pointing out that nobody, not even other Daedra, can say for certain how the Aedra and the Daedric princes actually relate to each other, and questioning whether the whole devouring story is even literally true or just a convenient legend that stuck. The dispute isn't just an old argument scholars have. It has actually driven real Orcish politics centuries after the fact. Among the Altmer, some still believe the arm of Trinimac bears arms against their enemies even now, shielding them in their darkest hour, as though the old god were still watching. Among the Orcs, some reject Malakath entirely and insist Trinimac never really vanished at all, that he simply gave his essence to Nirn the way the other Aedra did and can still be felt in the world. A king named Kurog once tried to reinstate Trinimac as the official religion of the Orsimer in the Second Era, and centuries later, a king named Gortwog Gro Nagorm built an entire priesthood around the idea that Trinimac still lived, and that Malakath was a separate, lying demon. Both attempts caused real division among Orcs who considered it heresy, and the argument over whether their god is dead, replaced, or simply pretending never fully settled, even down to the Fourth Era. One literary version of the story, credited to a writer named Tarvin Aram, goes further than most and fills in the aftermath in more detail. In this telling, the curse Malak had used against Boethia nearly killed the prince outright, and it took Mephala and Azura stepping in personally to lift the curse before Boethia recovered. Those same 2 princes are then said to have personally escorted the scattered followers of the old faith to their separate fates. One group sent east, one steered clear of the swamps where the Hist could reach them, one led into oblivion outright. Boethia, once recovered, is said to have dueled the newly broken Malakath directly, cleaving him into the Eshen wastes with a single strike so that his own bones became the foundation of what the Orcs call the Eshbit, then reshaping him further into a being sometimes called Moloch. That version is one specific piece of literature, not settled canon, but it says something that even this telling, which nobody claims is fact, still has 3 separate gods personally getting their hands dirty, finishing off what was left of the strongest knight the Altmer ever had. Something of the old god is still supposed to be reachable even now. Certain kinds of Orcish battle magic are described as calling down fragments of Trinimac himself, using whatever is left of him to heal an ally or strike down an enemy in the middle of a fight. Whether that's a piece of the actual god or just a name attached to a spell that would exist anyway, the Orcs who use it still call it by his name, not Malakath's. Malakath himself, small and vengeful as he became, is on record doing at least one thing no other god on this list ever did, killing his own child with his own hands. Sheogorath once tricked Malakath's demigod son, Emeg Grokaira, into a murderous frenzy, then invited Malakath to deal with the result. Malakath hunted his son down and beheaded him, and only after the blow landed did he realize what he had actually done was damn his own son to Sheogorath's realm rather than free him from it. Even a god reduced to curses and grudges can still act directly in the world. It just doesn't mean the act turns out well for the god or for whoever the god loves. What can be said without much argument is the shape of the outcome. A god who did real, direct, hands-on work protecting and policing his own people got consumed and replaced in the middle of doing exactly that, and the replacement that came out the other side was smaller and angrier than the original. Trinimac intervened for his people, and intervening is what got him destroyed. The next stop moves north, to Skyrim, and to a war fought between mortals and dragons. Before the war, there was a whole social order built on dragon rule. What is generally called the dragon cult started in Atmora and eventually spread south into Tamriel, where humans were kept under a much crueler hand than they had been in the old country. Under the dragons sat a special class of humans called dragon priests, granted power in exchange for administering the dragon's will, and under the priests sat everyone else, living under the heel of masters who could speak fire and never truly died. The seat of this whole system in Skyrim is generally believed to have been a place called Bromjunar, where dragon priests settled matters of law on their master's behalf. That is the world the Dragon War was fought to end. At some point in the Merethic era, the dragon Alduin, who called himself the firstborn of Akatosh, forsook the duties he was supposed to hold and set himself up as ruler over the mortal races instead. Under his rule, the Dove, the dragons, didn't just rule from a distance, they subjugated the mortal races directly, and Nordic legend describes the years that followed as genuinely brutal, dragons slaughtering the humans under them without much reason, beyond the pleasure of dominating something weaker. Alduin had a lieutenant during all this, his own younger brother, a dragon named Paarthurnax. According to the record, Paarthurnax took pity on the Nords' suffering under his brother's rule, and Nordic tradition holds that he did this specifically at the request of the goddess Kine. Paarthurnax himself has suggested his reasons weren't only pity. By his own account, part of what pushed him to break with his brother was that Alduin had started claiming the lordship of Akatosh for himself, treating their own father's throne as something he could simply take. Breaking with a brother who slaughtered mortals for pleasure is one kind of rebellion. Breaking with a brother who was also trying to claim their father's own name and title is another, and Paarthurnax's own words suggest both were part of it. Whatever the exact push was, Paarthurnax broke with Alduin and taught mortals how to use the Thu'um, the same voice power that dragons had always treated as exclusively their own. That single decision changed the war. The first tongues, the first mortals to master the voice this way, used their new power to develop something called Dragonrend, a shout built specifically to make an immortal dragon feel its own mortality. With Dragonrend, they were able to bring Alduin down and cast him forward through time itself, using an Elder Scroll, ending his reign, at least for a very long while. Kine's role here matters more than a single line of credit. She is the reason Nords can shout at all, in the sense that the entire tradition of the Thu'um among mortals traces back to this moment, to a goddess reportedly asking a dragon to teach humans a power that had belonged only to dragons before. It isn't an accident that Nords still call themselves the sons and daughters of Kine to this day. That title isn't just poetic, it is a direct callback to the goddess who is said to have started the whole tradition of mortals wielding the voice in the first place. Paarthurnax himself paid a price for switching sides that never really ended. After Alduin was cast out of time, Paarthurnax took up a permanent vigil at the throat of the world, the same mountain where his brother had been banished, and spent the following ages teaching mortals the way of the voice as the leader of the monastic order called the Greybeards. He lived under their protection, and later under the protection of the line of dragonborn emperors that began with Tiber Septim, for one very simple reason. The Blades, the same order sworn to protect dragonborn rulers, considered him a high-priority target for extermination because of the atrocities he had committed as Alduin's own lieutenant before he switched sides. A dragon, who helped found the entire Nordic tradition of the voice, spent the rest of his existence being hunted by the descendants of the very people that tradition was built to protect. And centuries later, when Alduin briefly returned, the Blades still argued that Paarthurnax's old crimes deserved punishment rather than pardon. Rebelling against Alduin never actually erased what he had done under him. It only changed who he did it for next. There is a detail about what dragons actually are that circles back to Akatosh directly. Some sources describe dragons and the dragonborn who can absorb their souls as literal fragments of Akatosh's own soul, split off when time itself began. An archmage named Shalidor put it more cautiously, calling dragons kindred of the time god, either his children, his lesser relations, or a part of him that broke away at the start of everything. Nobody treats this as settled. It's offered as a theory by named scholars who say so themselves, not as confirmed lore. But if any part of it's true, then every dragon Paarthurnax ever fought alongside or against, including his own brother, was carrying around some piece of the same god whose priests claim, elsewhere in this record, to have personally fought the dragons during the war. That would make the dragon war, in the most literal possible reading, one god's own children fighting each other. Centuries later, when Alduin briefly returned to the world, he offered his old brother one more chance to rejoin him or be destroyed. Paarthurnax refused again. What eventually happened to him after that isn't settled either. The Blades never stopped wanting him dead for what he had done under Alduin's rule, and the record simply says his final fate is unknown. There is a second claim tied to the same war, and it needs to be flagged more carefully than the Paarthurnax story because of where it comes from. Priests of the Nine Divines claim that Akatosh also intervened against the dragons directly during the Dragon War, helping bring it to an end, and that some dragons turned against their own kind as part of that intervention. This is a real claim found in the record, but it comes specifically from Akatosh's own clergy, people whose entire institutional purpose is to glorify Akatosh. It isn't corroborated by a neutral source, and no outside account confirms the dragon god of time personally showing up to fight his own children. It may well be true. It may just as easily be later priests filling in a gap in the story with the god they already worshipped. The honest thing to do is present it exactly as what it is, a claim from inside the church of the god being praised, not an independently witnessed event. So the Dragon War gives two interventions worth naming, one solid and one shakier. Paarthurnax teaching the Thu'um at Kain's apparent urging is well attested and still shapes an entire culture thousands of years later. Akatosh personally fighting the dragons is a claim that exists, but exists specifically inside the mouths of the people who benefit most from believing it. Not every intervention on this list is a war or a covenant that reshapes an empire. Some of them are small, almost easy to miss, single moments where a god reached down for one person and then apparently went quiet again. 4 of those small stories are worth telling here, because together they say something the big stories can't. The first happened to the Nerevarine, the hero of Morrowind, during a period of ordinary service to the imperial cult. Zenitar, the god of work and commerce, appeared to the Nerevarine disguised as an ordinary Redguard man named John Hawker. There was no thunder, no dragon avatar, just a god wearing an unremarkable name and an unremarkable face, working alongside a mortal without announcing what he was. After John Hawker was freed from whatever trouble he was in, the Nerevarine received his gauntlets, an artifact called Zenithar's Warning and Zenithar's Wiles, as thanks. It is a strange, quiet little story for a god whose entire reputation is built on honest work and modest reward, and that quietness fits him. The second belongs to Mara, and it's really a pattern more than a single event. Mara is described as repeatedly stepping in to reunite the dead with the living, letting the departed briefly return as ghosts to share final moments with loved ones before guiding them onward. This isn't a one-time miracle performed for a single favored worshipper. It happens across different races, with completely different beliefs about what happens after death, which makes it more striking rather than less. One documented case involves Mara reuniting Nuralanya, an Altmer of Clan Corelanya, with an orc named Gurlak, bringing two people from cultures with entirely different afterlives back together for one last moment. Mara's priesthood teaches that this kind of reunion is available even to couples as different as an Altmer and a Reachman, that nobody who truly loved another person has to enter death completely alone. A separate account has Mara doing this a different way, appearing in person rather than sending a spirit back. In the year 427 of the Third Era, on the island of Vardenfell, Mara is said to have appeared before the Nerevarine as an ordinary Breton woman, calling herself Amanin, and to have given the hero her own blouse and skirt as gifts, both later found to carry real protective and restorative power. It is a small, domestic kind of miracle for a goddess whose whole reputation rests on love and marriage, showing up disguised as an ordinary woman and handing over her own clothes. In Hammerfell, where Mara is worshipped under the name Morwa, she is often shown with 4 arms, said to let her grab more husbands at once, a bit of temple humor built right into the goddess's own artwork. All of it, the reunions and the disguise and the extra arms alike, is a quiet, recurring kind of intervention, more like a habit than an event. In the Reach, Mara's reach even extends into undeath. The spirits of Briarhearts, Reach folk, whose living hearts were cut out and replaced with something else, can't pass on to the afterlife at all unless the original heart is recovered, purified at the shrine of Mara, and properly buried. It is one more place where the goddess's influence runs underneath a whole culture's understanding of death, without a single scene of her ever appearing to explain it. Mara has also been the one handing out punishment to another god, not just comfort to mortals. According to the old creation songs, in the First Era, the gods punished a minor god named Sai, the god of luck, for failing to keep a pact with Ebonarm, the god of war, to spread luck across Tamriel while the greater gods stayed away. Sai was stripped of his body entirely for the failure. The record doesn't say Mara alone did this, only that the divine did, but it's another example of the same basic pattern, showing up between gods rather than between a god and a mortal. Acting directly comes with a price, and it doesn't matter whether the one paying it's a person or another god. One legend even credits Mara with a much bigger intervention than any of that, making another one of the divines. According to a text called Arkai the God, Arkai began as an ordinary mortal shopkeeper obsessed with a book written in a language he couldn't read, a book he spent years decoding while ignoring everyone and everything else in his life. By the time he finally understood what the book actually explained, life and death themselves, he was already dying of an incurable plague. He prayed to Mara as a last resort, asking for more time to finish his work. Instead of just granting the request, Mara gave him a choice: die as he was or become a god for eternity, charged with keeping life and death in balance across the whole universe. He chose godhood, and that choice is how Arkai entered the pantheon at all. That detail matters a few paragraphs from now, because this same god, the one whose entire existence traces back to a single act of mercy from Mara, later gets his own domain violated by a rival god with no recorded response of his own. The third involves Kain again, and this one is stranger than either of the first two. A Hagrivan named Keeper Ormi had gone through the transformation that turns a witch into that horrific half-bird, half-woman creature, a transformation that's normally treated as permanent and unbreakable without some kind of divine help. In Ormi's case, help came. After her son Sahum, believed dead, turned out to be alive after all and prayed for his mother, Kain intervened, cleansing Ormi of the corruption and restoring her. Of every documented Hagraven transformation in the record, this is the only one that was ever undone, and it took both an unlikely reunion and a direct act of Kain to make it happen. The fourth belongs to Yfre, and it fits with the idea from earlier that the Bosmeri god of the forest still occasionally reaches out to specific people even after spending himself into the rules of nature. Ifre is known to intervene for select figures, particularly the Sylvanar, a title held by a chosen leader among the Bosmer, and this intervention has gone as far as resurrecting a Sylvanar from death when the need was great enough. Given everything said earlier about Y'ffre having spent himself completely on becoming the Earthbones, this is a strange detail to hold next to that. Either the sources are not being perfectly consistent with each other on how total his sacrifice actually was, or there's some sliver of him still capable of small, specific acts even after the larger one. The sources don't resolve this, so it has to be left standing as it's 4 stories, 4 gods, all of them small, easy to overlook next to something like an emperor turning into a dragon. And here's the part worth sitting with plainly. Those 4 small, easy to miss interventions are still more than Stendar, Julianos, Dibella, and Archai have between them, combined, across their entire individual lore. 4 of the 8 divines, gods worshipped by soldiers, scholars, artists, and mourners across all of Tamriel, and none of them have a single confirmed instance in their own written history of personally reaching into the world and doing something. That has to be stated with the same care as before. Their own lore articles record no direct intervention, not that nothing resembling one has ever happened anywhere in the wider setting. People will point to institutions built in these gods' names, the vigil of Stendar hunting down Daedra, Dibella choosing a Sibyl to speak for her, Julianos' temples educating generations of scholars, Archai's priests keeping the dead from rising as undead. All of that's real, and all of it matters to how these gods are worshipped. None of it's the god personally showing up. There is one borderline case worth naming, honestly, because it's the kind of thing a careful viewer would bring up otherwise. A strange run of political good fortune in the Iliac Bay region, an event later nicknamed the Miracle of Peace, gets credited in the histories to 3 gods at once, Mara, Akatosh, and Stendar. That sounds, on the surface, like exactly the kind of direct intervention this video is looking for. Looked at closely though, it's a single after-the-fact credit line attached to an outcome nobody can otherwise explain, not a description of any of the 3 gods appearing, speaking, or doing anything a narrator could actually describe. Nobody claims to have seen Stendar. Nobody records him lifting a hand. The event gets called a miracle and stamped with his name because the alternative, a coincidence too large to sit comfortably, was worse. That is a very different thing from Akatosh appearing over the imperial city as a burning dragon, and it's worth telling the difference apart plainly instead of letting a vague credit line pass as proof. It is also worth saying plainly that the length of a god's own written history has nothing to do with how many times that god has actually acted. Akatosh, Y'ffre, Mara, and Stendar all have long detailed records covering temples, festivals, priesthoods, and centuries of worship practice across a dozen cultures. Some of that length comes from real events, the ones already told here. A lot of it's just institution, what a chapel looks like, what color robes a priest wears, which cities built a shrine first. Strip all of that away and look only for a moment where the god personally does something, and the 4 gods at the center of this stop come up empty, no matter how many pages get written about their temples. There is an actual explanation on record for why so many of the divines stay quiet, rather than just an absence where an explanation should be. The Aedra gave enormous amounts of their own power toward building Mundus in the first place, the same cost already covered earlier in this list, and what that cost left behind is described plainly. The divines are left in a much reduced state, unable to interfere with mortal affairs as freely as the Daedra, who keep their full power sitting safely in oblivion. Because of that, the record itself describes most of the divines as impersonal, generally benevolent spirits, worthy of prayer but without any strong direct relationship to the people praying to them. That isn't a guess about why Stendar, Julianos, Dibella, and Archai stay silent. It is closer to the actual stated reason. Stendar comes the closest of the 4 to a personal act, and even that comes down to one nameless, undated story. an armor blessed after Stendar noticed a woman's selflessness, its protection strong enough afterward to turn necromancers attacking her to dust on contact. There is also a vague line claiming the god accompanied Tiber Septim in his later years, with no further detail given anywhere. Beyond that, everything else tied to Stendar, including the vigil that bears his name, is described strictly from the mortal side. Mortals founding an order after the Oblivion Crisis, not Stendar appearing to start one. Julianos has even less to point to. His entire record of contact with the mortal world comes down to forging one piece of the Crusaders' relics for Pelinal, the same pattern every one of the quieter gods shares. What he does have is presence, not action. A reputation as the god who recites the damned equation, an owl for a symbol, and monastic orders founded by Tiber Septim specifically to guard the Elder Scrolls in his name. All of that describes a god people trust with knowledge. None of it describes a god who ever showed up. Dibella's case is the clearest example of an institution standing in for an act. Worshippers believe Dibella makes her well known through a chosen sibyl, but the actual selection process described in the record is a closed ceremony run entirely by Dibella's own priesthood, kept secret even from ordinary worshippers, sometimes choosing a sibyl as young as a child. Nowhere in that description does Dibella herself appear, choose, or speak. Believers may be right that the goddess is working through the ceremony. What is actually written down is a priesthood making a decision in her name. Arkai's file has one claim worth naming honestly, because it shows exactly how a myth can grow a god's role over time, rather than reporting it fresh. A shield originally credited to one of Arkai's own saints, blessed sometime after her death, gets remembered generations later as a gift from Arche himself, not from the saint at all. A separate, later priest named Florentius Bainius claimed he could hear Arkai's voice directly and seemed to know things he had no other way of knowing, but his own colleagues were openly skeptical of the claim, and the record preserves that skepticism right alongside it, instead of treating it as settled. Even Arkai's Nordic precursor, a god named Orki, is remembered for one active, direct deed, cursing every Nord down to a 6-year lifespan before Shor lifted most of the curse and dumped it onto the orcs instead. That deed belongs to Orke though, by name, not to Arche, and the record calls it legend rather than history. Arkai's entire sphere, the natural cycle of birth and death, was violated at its root when Molag Bal created vampirism specifically to spite him. That is stated plainly in the record as Molag Bal's whole motive. A rival god took the very domain Mara had once made him a god to protect and twisted it into something that mocks everything Arkai is supposed to stand for, and Arkai's own lore article records no answer to it. No confrontation, no counter miracle, just silence where a response might be expected from the god whose entire purpose was supposedly threatened. It's worth going back to Alessia now, because everything told earlier about the Covenant left out the human cost, and that cost is really the point of telling her story on a list like this one. Alessia wasn't born with that name. Alessia is a corruption of a title, Al-Esh, meaning High Highness, given to her by her own followers once she started leading them. A second title used for her was Paravant, meaning the first. Out of corruptions of those two titles came a whole string of other names she is remembered by among different peoples. Perif, Paraval, Pevesh, Perethu, Paravania, Esha, and Alashut, among others. She has been called the Slave Queen, the Mother of the Empire, and the Queen of Stars, and among the Aelids she ruled over during the rebellion, she was known with real contempt as the Cattle Queen. Later titles piled on top of the older ones too: Lady of Heaven, Queen Utsirad, Queen of Mortals, First Empress, and Elestia among them. She is even tied to a constellation, remembered in the night sky as the Thief. By the time she died, Alessia had already been given more titles and more marriages than most mortals ever get in legend. Beyond her actual marriage to Morihaus, she is described in some sources as becoming wife to both Shor and Auriel as well. an honor that reads less like ordinary marriage and more like a way of saying every major god of both traditions she had spent her life reconciling ended up claiming her as their own. Among the worshippers of Pelinal Whitestrake specifically, Alessia holds the position of patron saint of humanity itself. One especially strange detail attaches to Alessia's deathbed scene, and it's worth including exactly as it's written without smoothing it over. Pelinal Whitestrake is described as present at Alessia's death despite having been killed decades earlier at White Gold Tower. Whatever showed up beside her, the account says he described another half that, together with himself, would take her up and reveal their true faces. Faces which, in the account's own words, eat one another in amnesia each age. Nobody has ever explained plainly what that means. Mani Marco, centuries later, claimed Pelinal could even account for his own whereabouts during a dragon break that happened roughly 1,000 years after Pelinal died, which is its own kind of impossible claim from its own kind of unreliable source. The detail belongs here not because it can be explained, but because leaving it out would make Alessia's death sound tidier than the record actually makes it. Even where she was actually buried is disputed. One tradition holds she was laid to rest in the catacombs beneath Sancretor, the same holy city she founded, a tradition later continued by Riemann Serodil and his own dynasty, who chose to be buried there as well, specifically to associate themselves with her. A competing tradition says she was instead buried on the very site where the Temple of the One would later stand in the imperial city. Centuries afterward, a mysterious figure known only as the Prophet of Anvil claimed to be able to sense the presence of the Oversoul locked inside the Amulet of Kings and even hear it speak, and claimed specifically to hear Alessia herself weeping for a fallen Cyrodiil, asking for someone of her blood to walk in her steps and rekindle the covenant she had died to create. A separate legacy of her deathbed vision, the teachings passed down through a prophet named Maruch, who claimed Alessia had appeared to him and questioned the legitimacy of Elven rule, went on to shape an entire fundamentalist movement, the Alessian Order, whose secret inner sect eventually taught that resisting the emperor was the same as resisting the gods themselves. A vision meant to free a people from slavery ended up feeding a movement that used her name to justify exactly the kind of absolute obedience she had once fought against. Even what Alessia actually looked like didn't survive intact. Once that same fundamentalist Alessian order rose to power roughly a century after her death, depictions of Alessia herself were posthumously outlawed, and almost none from her own lifetime survive today. The earliest portraits still around were made centuries later, likely commissioned as gifts for a much later empress, which means most of what people now picture when they think of Alessia's face was invented long after she died. None of those titles changed what actually happened to her body and her soul when she died. Her actual fate, stripped of the honorifics, is that her soul was filed into a gemstone to power a door. That is what the covenant with Akatosh really came down to. Once the ceremony and the songs were stripped away, a woman who had led a slave revolt, built an empire, and invented a religion to hold two peoples together, ended her life as fuel for a barrier against oblivion. Her soul locked permanently into the Kimela Dabal alongside every emperor who would ever come after her. She got the Slave Queen title and the Mother of the Empire title and the Queen of Stars title. What she actually got, physically, was absorbed into a stone that other people would spend the next 4,000 years fighting over, stealing, losing, and eventually smashing. Every stop up to this point has been a god reaching down to touch the mortal world. This next one runs the other direction, a man reaching up and, according to the record, actually making it. Tiber Septim became the 9th divine. The pantheon Alessia designed, the 8 divines built to hold her fractured new empire together, gained a member roughly 3,000 years later, and the new member wasn't a healer or a farmer or a scholar. He was a conqueror. Upon his death, so great were his deeds considered to be that he became a god himself, joining the ranks of the gods he had, in life, sworn to serve, becoming Talos, patron of soldiers, generals, and questing adventurers, and by most measures, the most widely glorified god of the human race. Who Talos actually was before he became a god is genuinely disputed, and not in the mild way most of the other disputes on this list are. Most sources, including the Underking himself, one of the few beings claiming direct, personal knowledge of the events, say Talos was born Tiber Septim, who was also known by the name Zurin Arctus, an imperial battle mage who served at the emperor's side for years before the two of them became entangled, in a way the sources still can't fully untangle, in the fate of a single soul. A separate heretical account known as the Arcturian heresy makes an entirely different figure, Wismir Wolfhearth, a candidate for the identity behind the throne, suggesting the man who conquered Tamriel wasn't simply one person at all, but some kind of merged or interchangeable being made up of more than one soul occupying the same role. Nobody has ever fully settled this. It is the single most disputed case anywhere in the setting of a man becoming a god, one where even the basic question of which man is still argued over. Some scholars have tried to explain the dispute instead of just reporting it, suggesting Zurin Arctus and Wolfhearth were bound together through something called an enantiomorph, a state in which two individuals effectively merge into one combined soul, interchangeable in the historical record because at some level they briefly stop being separate. One version of that theory goes further and claims Zurin specifically won the merger, that whatever consciousness came out the other side was more Zurin than Wolfhearth. That theory doesn't settle anything either. It just gives a name to how thoroughly tangled the identity of Talos is, underneath all the songs and temples built in his honor. A god this widely worshipped, patron of soldiers and generals across the entire human empire, and nobody can fully agree who he actually was as a man, not even his birth name, which some accounts give as Halti Earlybeard, rather than Tiber Septim at all. Wolfhearth himself is tied to still another identity, an earlier incarnation called the Ash King, supposedly summoned back to fight the Dwemer at the Battle of Red Mountain in the First Era and summoned again, centuries later, to help repel a second Akaviri invasion. Some accounts of that later battle call the Ash King the Underking outright, tangling the identities together even further. A separate theory that the necromancer Manimarco was secretly the Underking all along is generally dismissed by the sources as unsubstantiated, since the two are remembered as rivals with opposite goals rather than the same person wearing two names. Whoever he actually was underneath, the conquest itself was finished with the help of a weapon far stranger than any army, Numidium, a colossal machine built centuries earlier by the Dwemer, a lost race of deep elves who vanished from the world under circumstances nobody has ever explained. The Dwemer had built it as a vessel to make themselves gods, a way to transcend Mundus entirely, and vanished before they ever got to use it that way themselves. Every time Numidium was activated, it did visible damage to time itself, distortion serious enough that the later chaos caused by a second activation came to be nicknamed the Second Numidian Effect. That is the very short version of a story that belongs, in full, to its own telling elsewhere. What matters here is just this. The newest god on Tamriel's official pantheon got there by conquering the continent with a machine built by a vanished people who had wanted to become gods with it themselves. And even his own name and identity are still argued about by the people who worship him. The actual moment a conquering general is supposed to have become a god gets almost no description anywhere in the record. The sources say plainly that upon his death he is believed to have ascended and joined the divines, and that's close to the whole account. Compare that to what happens later in this list. When Martin Septim becomes an avatar of Akatosh, that moment gets an actual mechanism, a summoned spirit, a transformation witnessed by people who were there and lived to describe it. Talos' ascension gets no equivalent scene. The most worshipped human god in the entire pantheon became a god, by his own official record, off-camera. Whoever the Underking actually was underneath, his own fate afterward is at least concrete, even where his identity never gets settled. Having spent nearly all of his strength defeating Numidium once already, he retreated into a long sleep in a hidden vault somewhere in High Rock to slowly recover it. During Tiber Septim's own reign, he is said to have cursed 4 blades sent to investigate corruption at Sancretor, trapping them in undeath to guard the ruins as revenge against the emperor himself. A curse that held for centuries until it was finally broken during the Oblivion Crisis, by the same hero of Kuwatch whose story comes right after this one. After Tiber Septim's death, the Underking reportedly appeared once more, this time to Tiber's own grandson, Pelagius I, claiming to have been sent by Tiber himself to help guide the new emperor's reign, a period remembered afterward as a golden age that ended only when Pelagius was murdered. His own end came decades later, when he woke from his long sleep, crossed a bay to reach a rebuilt Numidium, and rejoined with the heart he had lost centuries earlier in one final explosion. For one brief moment he was flesh and blood again. Then, by his own account, he finally got the one thing he claimed to actually want, to die for good, rather than go on being whatever he had become, having said beforehand that he had no desire to tamper further with mortal affairs, an echo, whether anyone intended it or not, of the very same withdrawal the Aedra chose for themselves back at the convention. His own epigraph, still quoted at the start of unrelated histories centuries later, sums up the shape of this whole list better than anything written specifically about it. Each event is preceded by prophecy, but without the hero there is no event. That dispute over Talos' identity turns out to matter far beyond scholarly curiosity. Centuries later, when a foreign power wants an excuse to strip Talos out of the pantheon entirely, the official reasoning given is that a man can't become a god, full stop, no matter what he conquered or who he might have been underneath the crown. The argument over who Talos really was isn't just trivia. It is the exact seam later generations would try to pull apart to erase him. Everything on this list has been building toward one moment, and it happened in the year 433 of the Third Era, in the middle of the imperial city, to a man who was never actually crowned. Martin Septim was the illegitimate son of Emperor Uriel Septim VII, raised in secret and told his whole life that his father was a farmer. He grew up with no idea he had royal blood, apprenticed briefly with the Mages Guild, and drifted for a while into worship of the Daedric Prince Sanguine, after growing impatient with the guild's restrictions, treating knowledge and power as his real gods for a time. He even carried one of Sanguine's own artifacts for a while, the Sanguine Rose, before he turned away from that path entirely after a tragedy involving the deaths of several friends, a tragedy he blamed on his own hunger for secrets he had no business chasing. He rededicated himself to the 9 Divines and became a priest of Akatosh in the city of Kuwatch. That is where he was, serving as Brother Martin, when the rest of his family was murdered. Uriel Septim VII knew almost nothing of his illegitimate son beyond occasional reports on his progress, right up until the day Daedric assassins came for him. His final instruction, given to a prisoner he had only just met, was simple: find his son and close shut the jaws of oblivion. Around that same time, Daedra struck the city of Kuwatch itself, and Martin, the quiet priest nobody outside the chapel would have recognized as an emperor's son, joined the effort to barricade the survivors inside the chapel of Akatosh, reportedly saving many lives in the process before he even knew his own father was already dead. The Mythic Dawn, a cult devoted to the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon, assassinated Uriel Septim VII along with every legitimate heir to the throne, and in doing so, they broke the ancient covenant forged all the way back on Alessia's deathbed. With no dragonborn heir left to keep the dragonfires burning, Mehrunes Dagon tore the veil separating Nirn from his realm. The dragonfires themselves were rendered useless. Gates to Dagon's realm opened across the imperial city, and Dagon himself, the god who had spent centuries being summoned only in small, careful, controlled rituals, manifested in person, a red, 4-armed colossus standing in the literal heart of Tamriel, intent on nothing less than its destruction. Martin, tracked down and protected by agents of the Blades once his existence became known, spent the crisis learning everything he could about the cult that had murdered his family, using knowledge from his own time flirting with Daedric worship to understand exactly what the mythic Dawn believed and why. He was eventually proclaimed Emperor Martin Septim I by the High Chancellor, but he was never actually crowned. There was no time. Before the coronation could happen, Dagon launched his final assault on the city to make sure it never did. Before any of that, Martin and his guide had already been tested more than once. They reached Waynon Priory just in time to save the Blades' Grandmaster from a mythic Dawn attack, but not in time to stop the cult from stealing the Amulet of Kings itself, which forced Martin to retreat to Cloudruler Temple, the most secure Blades fortress left in Cyrodiil, where he was hailed as Dragonborn despite never having worn a crown. From there, working from a hostile book called the Mysterium Xarxus, written by Mehrunes Dagon himself, and dangerous even to read without protection, Martin worked out how to track down the cult's leader and reclaim the amulet from a false paradise the leader had built for himself. He asked the Countess of Bruma to let a great gate to oblivion open just outside her walls, then personally led the defense of the city while his own champion went through that gate to retrieve what was needed to breach the enemy's stronghold. A priest with no military training ended up organizing the defense of an entire city under Daedric assault, because there was nobody else left standing who could. Martin fought his way from the White Gold Tower to the Temple of the One with what escort he had left, and once there, he did something no emperor before him had ever done on purpose. He shattered the Amulet of Kings. The relic that had held every emperor's soul since Alessia's, the stone that powered the Covenant itself, was destroyed by the one person who might have used it to become emperor in the ordinary sense. In its place, Martin transformed into an avatar of Akatosh, appearing as a dragon made of fire. According to some sources, this was more than a transformation of convenience. Martin actually mantled Akatosh in that moment and became a god himself, becoming, for however long the fight lasted, truly one with the god whose priest he had once been. That claim is stated carefully as what it is, a claim some sources make and others don't, rather than a settled fact. The Avatar defeated Mehrunes Dagon. Then, its purpose finished, it turned to stone at the center of the ruined temple, and it has stood there ever since. The whole enormous feat cost Martin his life. There was no walking away from it, no return to the throne he was never crowned onto in the first place. What his death bought was described, in the histories written afterward, as sealing the gates of oblivion so completely that even a sigil stone, an object in whose presence, according to the old phrase, 1,000 soul gems would likely dissolve, couldn't breach the new barrier for more than fleeting moments. The single most destructive Daedric artifact known to exist could no longer force its way through what Martin's sacrifice had built. Conjecture about what actually happened at the Temple of the One is, in the words of the record itself, rampant across Tamriel. The Nords have their own version, believing Martin became Akatosh's spirit outright and personally killed Mehrunes Dagon with his own hands. Not merely as an avatar acting on the god's behalf, but as the god himself in every sense that mattered. The Thalmor, for their part, have tried at various points to take credit for ending the crisis themselves, downplaying Martin's role entirely in favor of their own people's supposed heroism. Neither claim can be checked against the other. What isn't disputed is that Martin Septim, last of the Septim bloodline, uncrowned, illegitimate by birth, and a priest by choice rather than a soldier, is the one who stood at the temple when it mattered and didn't come back from it. Even people who were there afterward weren't sure exactly what to call what had happened to him. The champion who had fought alongside Martin through the whole crisis was left wondering afterward whether Martin was simply dead or whether he might have ascended to stand alongside his own ancestor Tiber Septim as a god in his own right. Years later, the same champion, having gone on to a strange fate of their own as a Daedric prince, still described Martin as the best septim that's ever ruled, while also noting, almost as an aside, that turning into a dragon god was hardly sporting toward the rest of the septim line. Even the people closest to the event never landed on a single, tidy way to describe what Martin Septim actually became in his last few minutes alive. It's worth landing plainly on the shape of what happened here, because it's the exact reverse of where this whole story started. The covenant made on Alessia's deathbed, the one that had run continuously for roughly 4,000 years, the one every emperor since had renewed by lighting the dragon fires, was broken in order to save the world. The door itself, the very thing the whole covenant existed to maintain, had to be destroyed in order to shut it for good. The crisis left a mark on how Tamriel governed and worshipped for generations afterward. Some records call the whole event the Great Anguish, not the Oblivion Crisis, which gives some sense of how it was felt at the time. Fear of Daedra and dark magic spiked hardest in places that had been hit hardest, especially Skyrim, and out of that fear came the Vigil of Stendarr, an order founded specifically in response to the crisis with one job: hunt down Daedra and anyone practicing the dark arts. A smaller group calling themselves the Keepers of the Razor tracked down one of Dagon's own weapons, Mehrunes' razor, and broke it into 3 separate pieces, handing them down through their own descendants for generations specifically to keep the whole thing out of occultists' hands again. Not every front of that war needed outside help either. In Black Marsh, the Hist called Argonians home to fight the invasion directly, and by the Argonians' own account, it was their counterattack, not any god's intervention or any amulet's power, that forced the Oblivion gates in that province closed. It is one of the only places in this entire record where mortals beat Daedra back through their own force alone, with no divine credited at all. That leaves one stop left, and it's the quietest one on the whole list, which is exactly why it belongs at the end. In the year 171 of the 4th era, the Aldmeri Dominion, through its ruling faction known as the Thalmor, sent an ultimatum to the Emperor of Cyrodiil. Among their demands, tribute, the disbandment of the Blades, the surrender of large sections of Hammerfell, and, alongside all of that, a ban on the worship of Talos, the god who had been added to the pantheon roughly 3,000 years earlier by a conqueror's death. The Emperor refused. In response, the Thalmor ambassador overturned a cart in front of him, spilling out the severed heads of every Blades agent operating in Dominion territory, and the Great War began. The fighting itself was worse than a quick summary can show. Within days of the declaration, 2 Dominion armies struck at once. One crossed out of Valenwood into western Cyrodiil and then down into Hammerfell, while a second landed straight onto Hammerfell's southern coast. Imperial forces retreated across the Alik'r Desert in a stretch of the war still remembered as the March of Thirst. The Imperial Navy fought to hold the waters around the capital itself, defending the Nibben and Lake Rumere, while legions from Skyrim marched south to reinforce the city. None of it held. Dominion forces under a Thalmor general named Lord Narfin took Leawin, then Anvil, then Bravil, and reached the Imperial city by the end of 172. When the city finally fell in 174, the Emperor broke out to the north, sacrificing an entire legion just to buy the time to reach Skyrim. What actually turned the war back around is one of the stranger, quieter stories in this whole record, because the person who did it doesn't even have a name. Narifin wasn't simply occupying the city. He was working towards something called the Culling, helped along by a servant of the Daedric Prince Boethia and by an artifact of Vaermina used to track Imperial troop movements. Retaking the city meant stopping that ritual, and by the winter of 174 into 175, the Emperor himself was in no shape to lead the assault, having just survived an assassin's attack. So he handed command to someone the record calls only the Forgotten Hero, and sent that person into battle wearing the Emperor's own guise. The Forgotten Hero broke into the city at what became known as the Battle of the Red Ring, found Narifin personally, defeated him, and shut the Oblivion Gate he had opened to carry out the culling. Afterward, the Emperor took the credit. What actually happened to Narifin himself isn't even settled. Most accounts say he died of his wounds after being kept alive for 33 days, though at least one version claims a winged Daedra carried him off instead. Even the ending of the battle that saved the war doesn't stay clean, and the person who actually won it is remembered, in the record's own words, only as forgotten. Hammerfell had its own version of the same grinding war. A soldier named Angerion is remembered as the hero of the Battle of Rosegard, one of the few Hammerfell engagements of the war to get its own name and its own credited hero, a rare case of an ordinary soldier's name actually surviving this whole conflict intact. General Decianus, ordered to abandon the province and reinforce Cyrodiil, disobeyed by discharging much of his own army as wounded instead, tricking the Dominion into believing Hammerfell's legions were still pinned down while Redguard forces kept fighting on their own. Long feuding Redguard factions, the Crowns and the Forebears, reconciled enough to fight side by side doing it. Up in Skyrim, Reachman took advantage of the Empire's distraction to seize the city of Markarth outright and held it for 2 years, a full lifetime before Ulfric Stormcloak's own later run in with the Reach over the same city. After the White Gold Concordat ended the war everywhere else, Hammerfell alone refused to accept the terms and kept fighting the Dominion to a standstill for 5 more years, finally forcing a separate peace, the Second Treaty of Strathmakai, in the year 180. Redguards who lived through it later pointed to that treaty as proof the whole war could have gone differently if the rest of the Empire had held on the way Hammerfell did. Ulfric Stormcloak himself, decades before Markarth, was one more casualty of that same war. Captured early on, he was tortured and interrogated by a Thalmor agent named Elenwen, the same officer who would later run the persecution campaign in Skyrim. She let him believe the information pulled from him had helped bring down the Imperial City, when in fact none of it had mattered, and then let him go anyway, judging him more useful to Thalmor interests free than dead. The man who would later force the Empire's hand on the Talos ban in Markarth had already, without knowing it, spent time as a tool the Thalmor used and then released on purpose. The war left smaller, human traces behind it too, the kind that don't make it into treaties. One veteran, named Marcius Celius, went on to fight afterward as a gladiator in the Imperial arena. Galmar Stonefist carried his service straight into Ulfric Stormcloak's later rebellion. Legate Rikke stayed with the Legion and eventually helped put that same rebellion down. Others simply went home, many of them proud enough of what they had done to keep their old armor as a keepsake for the rest of their lives. Even a minor king, Durag Robatul of Bloodfall, marched his own soldiers into the fighting on the Empire's side, one more name among many that the war swallowed and mostly forgot. The war went badly for the Empire overall. After 4 years of fighting, with the legions exhausted and much of the Empire devastated, Emperor Titus Mede II signed the White Gold Concordat in the year 175. The Empire lost. And one of the terms of that surrender was exactly what the Thalmor had demanded from the very start. Worship of one of the 9 divines became illegal, punishable by the Empire's own Thalmor-monitored justiciars. Across the entire territory, the Empire still controlled. The Thalmor were never shy about what they actually wanted out of any of this. Their own stated purpose, in the years after the war, was described as the pacification and purification of all of Tamriel, aimed at bringing about what they called a new Merethic era, a phrase that means turning the clock back past every century of human rule, human gods, and human empire built up since. Propaganda produced under that banner included a tract simply titled The Talos Mistake, and the title alone says plainly enough what the Thalmor considered Talos to be, an error that needed correcting, not a god that needed debating. None of this came out of nowhere. Decades before the Talos ban, in the year 42 of the Fourth Era, Thalmor mages wiped out an entire refugee quarter of their own dissident Altmer in the city of Sentinel, an event remembered as the Night of Green Fire, targeting people considered impure by blood or belief. Centuries before that, in the Second Era, a secret faction inside the Thalmor, called the Sea Thalmor, had already tried and failed to assassinate their own queen in the name of building what they called a perfect dominion. The instinct to purify first and ask questions later didn't start with Talos. Talos worship was simply the largest, most visible target it eventually landed on. The ban didn't stay a quiet piece of paperwork for long. At first, it was only loosely enforced, with plenty of shrines to Talos left standing unbothered. That changed after what became known as the Markarth incident, when Nord militia under a man named Ulfric Stormcloak crushed a Reachman uprising in the city of Markarth and demanded as their price a repeal of the local ban on Talos worship, a demand the Empire was forced to grant. That single concession brought the Thalmor down on Skyrim directly, insisting on the right to send their own justiciars into the province to hunt and arrest suspected Talos worshippers, and the resentment that followed helped ignite a civil war that had nothing to do with dragons or Daedra, and everything to do with which god a person was legally allowed to pray to. The ban wasn't just paperwork for the people caught underneath it, either. Around the year 180, Thalmor justiciars under an officer named Aranande moved through the town of Rivercrest, hunting a hidden temple of Talos, intending to kill everyone found worshipping there. A local man named Henrik helped warn the worshippers before the Thalmor arrived, and the Thalmor found out and killed him for it. By the year 201, the Thalmor's operation out of their embassy in Skyrim, run by an officer named Elenwen, had grown into something closer to a standing campaign. Nords who so much as questioned Thalmor doctrine were secretly captured and imprisoned, and justiciars in the province were on record openly favoring what the sources plainly call a genocidal policy toward the very Nords. They were supposedly just policing for illegal worship. None of that happened in secret from history. It is written down plainly as what enforcing the ban actually looked like on the ground, without a single line anywhere describing Talos or any other divine doing anything about it. Stop and look at what that actually is. Every other event on this list was a god stepping in over something smaller than this. Akatosh forged a covenant to protect Tamriel from oblivion itself. Martin Septim tore that covenant apart and gave his life to seal a door that would have let the Deadlands pour into the world. Cain asked a dragon to teach mortals how to fight back against a race of tyrants who had been eating the world's freedom for centuries. And here, one god, worshipped across an entire empire by soldiers who fought and died under his banner, by Nords who call themselves the children of the very goddess who is said to have helped raise him to power, gets legally erased from public worship by treaty, enforced at the point of a Thalmor blade, and in the entire written record of Tamriel's history, there is no divine response to it. No avatar rose out of a broken relic, no plague fell on the Thalmor embassies enforcing the ban, no golden dragon descended over the imperial city the way it had during the Oblivion Crisis. Nothing. The god who had, according to some sources, personally mantled a dying man to save all of Tamriel from Mehrunes Dagon didn't so much as flicker when his own worship was outlawed by a piece of paper. The lore simply doesn't supply an answer to this, and the honest way to close a video like this one is to say that plainly, rather than invent a divine response the record doesn't contain, and let the silence sit exactly where it actually falls. Walking back over all of it, the pattern holds from one end of Tamriel's history to the other. When a god acts, it's almost always through a mortal, and the mortal pays for it in full. Alessia gets a title and a soul locked in a stone. Pelinal gets cut into 8 pieces by the people he beat. Ifris spends himself completely and can never act again. Trinimac gets eaten and replaced by something weaker wearing his memory. Martin dies and turns to stone in a ruined temple. Even Morihaus, born a demigod, loses the one gift his own mother gave him the moment he grows too proud of it. And the 4 gods that ordinary people actually pray to the most, day to day, for mercy, for wisdom, for beauty, for a decent burial, Stendar, Julianus, Dibella, and Archai, have no confirmed record of ever personally acting at all. Whatever they have done, if they have done anything, hasn't made it into their own written history in any form stronger than an institution built in their name by mortals who never claimed to have seen the god in person. None of the rival versions ever got resolved either. Whoever canonized Alessia, whether Martin actually became a god for those last few minutes, whether Trinimac is dead or imprisoned or lying about the whole thing, whether Talos was Zurin Arctus or Wulfart or some tangle of both, every one of those arguments sits exactly as open today as it did when this list started. And it's worth noticing, one more time, who tends to come out ahead in each version. Boethiah's own standing among the Dunmer only grew after swallowing Trinimac. The Thalmor's account of the Great War and of the Oblivion Crisis both happen to leave the Thalmor looking better than anyone else's account does. Whoever survives long enough to write the story down usually writes it in their own favor. The record ends on the quietest note of all: a whole religion outlawed by treaty, enforced across an empire, and not one line anywhere describing what the god at the center of it did about it.